Good evening. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from the town of Kalamata on the southern coast of Greece on February 14th, 2024. And what I wanted to talk about this evening was Israel's really bad week. I'd like to begin reviewing the events of the past few days insofar as they relate to Israel and its assault upon Gaza by mentioning a statement of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, QC, on February 12th, this past Sunday. As an assault by the Israeli military on the southern portion of the Gaza Strip bordering the Egypt with Israel was looming, the prosecutor of the ICC stated as follows, and I quote, "I'm deeply concerned by the reported bombardment and potential ground incursion by Israeli forces in Rafah. My office has an ongoing and active investigation into the situation in the state of Palestine. This is being taken forward as a matter of the utmost urgency, with a view to bringing to justice those responsible for Rome Statute crimes. All wars have rules, and the laws applicable to armed conflict cannot be interpreted so as to render them hollow or devoid of meaning. This has been my consistent message, including from Ramallah last year. Since that time, I have not seen any discernible change in conduct by Israel. Those who are in breach of the law will be held accountable." Close quote. Now, it's true, and it's something that I've commented upon extensively. There's good reason to be skeptical about the wherewithal of the ICC prosecutor and his determination to pursue Israeli war criminals in the International Criminal Court. Karim Khan was promoted to the position of ICC prosecutor by the British government, the Tory government of the United Kingdom, quite aggressively, and they celebrated openly when they achieved what they regarded as a significant diplomatic feat by securing his election to the post of ICC prosecutor. Immediately upon coming to office, he could have amassed, within a matter of weeks, if not months, adequate evidence to found a strong, not only a meritorious, but a strong case of war crimes against senior Israeli officials. And here I'm talking in particular about the settlements. These are the product of Israeli government policy. They have been expanding within the West Bank for some decades. The West Bank was reserved by the United Nations as territory for a future Palestinian state. In 2004, the International Court of Justice, I should say, in an advisory opinion, unanimously ruled, all 15 judges, that the settlements violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. They are unquestionably a war crime. And certainly, if not within a few weeks, within the past 3 years, if Karim Khan was actually minded to honor the words he spoke on February 12th of this year, he could have brought an indictment. And we can contrast his laxity in that regard, his failure to act at all, to the swiftness with which he indicted Russian President Vladimir Putin after the invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. It took him much less than 18 months to bring an indictment for charges, frankly, which are not nearly as grave as those which one could sustain against Israel, which is now in the process of committing a genocide. So yes, we have ample reason to be skeptical, and it remains to be seen whether these words will be respected, whether the prosecutor will act. But this is, by any fair assessment of his prior commentary, the most assertive statement he has made thus far. And it is, I think, fair to say that he has come under intense pressure, global criticism for his failure to act. And at some point, he may well be in a position where he has no alternative, however reluctant he may be to go after a state that is going to be protected aggressively by the United States government and other Western governments should its leaders be indicted. I think it just might be at this stage that the Israeli military has crossed or is about to cross Karim Khan's red line. Now, we get some indication that this is how the Israeli elite views his February 12th statement from an article that was published by the Jerusalem Post on the following day, February 13th. The headline of the article was, "ICC's threat on Israel's Rafah invasion is serious, and this is why." And the article then went on to explain that unlike the International Court of Justice, which rendered that decision last month that it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide, the International Criminal Court which is the creature of a separate treaty, the Rome Statute, has an enforcement mechanism, meaning there is a much higher chance of it issuing arrest warrants against Israeli political and military leaders in the days and weeks ahead. Now, on the same day that the Jerusalem Post published that article, February 13th, South Africa's government announced it had lodged an urgent request, quote unquote, with the International Court of Justice to consider whether Israel's military operations targeting Rafah are a breach of the provisional order that the court handed down last month. Now, it bears repeating that that decision was rendered by a margin of 15-2. The only two judges who disagreed with the court's conclusion that it was plausible that Israel was violating the Genocide Convention were the Israeli judge who had been appointed on an ad hoc basis to the court, along with a South African judge, and he was the former Israeli Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak, and it's hardly surprising that he would have ruled differently from the rest of the judges. And the other judges who dissented from the 15-2 decision, the other judge was the Ugandan judge. And in that regard, it's interesting to note that within 48 hours of her dissenting opinion being published, the Ugandan government itself quite forcefully in a public statement renounced the decision and said, this does not represent the position of our government. What is most striking about the decision before the International Court of Justice is that all of the judges from the West or Western allied states voted in support of the conclusion that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide. Even though I was fully expecting a decision to go in South Africa's favor, even I was not anticipating that every one of these judges, the U.S. judge, who was the president of the court at the time and who served as a legal advisor in the State Department under Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she supported that conclusion. The German judge, and one can hardly imagine a state or a government that is more deferential to and supportive of Israel than the German government is. The Slovakian judge, the Australian judge, the judge from France, and the judge from Japan. All of them voted in favor of the conclusion that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide. And of course, this means, I think, that South Africa can anticipate a rather sympathetic hearing from the International Court of Justice, whose president is now from Lebanon. There has been a changeover at the top because of the normally scheduled retirement of the U.S. president of the court. In respect of the urgent request of the South African government for intervention into the pending assault on Rafah. So Israel now has at least two very serious threats confronting it in the international legal architecture. One from the ICC prosecutor, another decision potentially adverse to its agenda by the International Court of Justice. And in addition, since the decision of the International Court of Justice was rendered, a United States federal district court judge, a senior judge, in a case brought by Palestinians in U.S. court against Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, and U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, decided that it was plausible, also from his perspective, that Israel was violating the Genocide Convention. And although he decided that he did not have the jurisdiction to issue the injunctive relief that was sought by the plaintiffs in that case, he implored, and that was the word that he employed, implored the Biden administration to reassess what he called its unflinching support for Israel's attacks on Gaza. And on the other side of the pond, in the state of the Netherlands, the Dutch Court of Appeal in the past few days issued a decision that the Dutch government is obliged under the laws of the Netherlands international law not to send parts for F-35s to the state of Israel because there is a grave risk that they will be used in the commission of serious violations of international humanitarian law. So on the legal front, Israel is in real trouble, both in the domestic courts of Western states and in international tribunals. Now, let's talk a little bit about the military front. On Monday, February 12th, the Israeli military announced that 3 soldiers had been killed and 2 seriously wounded in Gaza as a result of an attack by Palestinian militants. One of the dead soldiers was a battalion commander, the other was a company commander, and the third was a sergeant. So these were not rank and file soldiers. Today, February 14th, Israel's military reported that in northern Israel, an Israeli soldier had been killed and several wounded in rocket attacks from Lebanon. The Israeli media described this as a, quote, ramping up, close quote, of attacks by Hezbollah in advance of Israel's offensive in Rafah. And we ought to recall that from the very outset of these attacks on Gaza, which began in October of last year, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has been quite clear that Israel risked all-out war if it were to bring the people of Gaza to the brink of annihilation. And certainly, I think we can fairly say, and tragically so, that that is precisely where they are now, the people of Gaza. So this may be a harbinger of a much larger war, one in which it would be extremely difficult for Israel to survive as we now know it, because Hezbollah has a missile arsenal that's some 10 times larger by many estimates in the West than the missile arsenal that it possessed in 2006 when it fought Israel to a standstill in the 2006 Lebanon war, and with a fraction of the soldiers that were deployed by the Israeli military into southern Lebanon, it repulsed the Israeli military and forced it back across the border. Not only does it have far more missiles now than it did then, but in addition, Hezbollah's missiles are much more sophisticated than they were then. And its soldiers are battle-hardened, having fought and prevailed in the brutal and bloody years-long conflict in Syria on the side of the current government of Syria, that of Bashar al-Assad. So this is a serious problem for Israel, to be sure. Fighting a two-front war is not one that's likely to turn out well at all for the apartheid state. And in addition, today, there was another report in the Israeli media that the rehabilitation center of the Israeli military is now anticipating receiving approximately 20,000 wounded veterans as a result of the war in Gaza alone. Obviously, that would be for the year 2024, 20,000 wounded veterans. Obviously, that number is likely to soar if an all-out war erupts with Hezbollah on the northern border, and possibly even with Iran. Now, on the public relations front, it has also been a terrible week for the state of Israel. On Monday, the Canadian polling firm Angus Reid published a poll showing that a plurality of Canadians, 41%, believe that Israel is committing genocide. Less than one-third, 32%, disagreed with that assertion. 27% said they're not sure. Even more surprising, this poll revealed that a plurality of the supporters of the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau's governing Liberal Party, believe that Israel is committing genocide, 44% of them, while only 28% disagree. Now, it is critical to understand that this perspective that so many Canadians now hold, that Israel is committing the worst crime against humanity, this has emerged in a media environment in Canada that is extremely favorable to Israel. The largest newspaper publisher in the country, Post Media, whose flagship newspaper is the National Post, has a strongly pro-Israel editorial posture. I think it's even fair to say that it's fanatically pro-Israel. It routinely publishes uncritically, unskeptically, the statements and claims made by the Israeli government, while routinely attacking through its op-ed pages supporters of Palestine as supporters of terrorism, as anti-Semites, doing all that it can to discredit in Canada the critics of Israel. The Globe and Mail, while perhaps not quite as unjournalistic in regard to Israel and Palestine as the National Post, also has a decidedly pro-Israel editorial posture. Toronto Star, widely read newspaper in Canada, CBC, the national broadcaster, somewhat more balanced than the Globe and Mail and Post Media, but nonetheless consistently putting a pro-Israel spin on the facts on the ground. Then you have the Global News and CTV, the two other major television broadcasters in Canada, both of them a strongly pro-Israel editorial posture. And I think it's fair to say, anybody looking at the situation, having analyzed the media environment in Canada for years, as I've tried to do, would conclude that this is a very favorable media environment for the state of Israel and Canada. and one that does not remotely do justice to the facts on the ground and to the Palestinian people. And yet, despite all of that, a significant plurality of Canadians now believe that Israel is committing genocide. If this is something that can happen in Canada, historically one of the strongest supporters of the State of Israel and the Zionist project, and if this can happen in particular in the Liberal Party of Canada, Israel is in real trouble in terms of public opinion. Also on Monday, the IMF, switching to the economic front, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank warned that the so-called Israel-Hamas war has already hit the regional economy in the Middle East and North Africa and could threaten global financial security. That was the thrust of its message. Now, this has undoubtedly increased the already immense pressure on Western governments to stop Israel's attacks on Gaza, because amongst other things, within the past year, there have been some major bank failures within the United States for reasons which at the time were unrelated to the conflicts in the Middle East. And there has been a considerable amount of weakness, an evident weakness in the European financial center, the European banking system, since the financial crisis erupted in full force in Europe in 2009, 2010. The banking sector has never really recovered from that, and one could easily imagine that in both the case of the US and the European financial sector and financial system, there would be serious trouble if the price of oil skyrocketed, which would have a massive and cascading effects across the global economy. And that's precisely what will happen if this war escalates considerably in the region, particularly if it begins to embroil directly the state of Iran and causes the closure of two waterways, one bordering on Yemen and one bordering on Iran, that are absolutely essential to the delivery of oil supplies and gas supplies by maritime shipping to destinations all around the world. Returning now to the military political front. On Sunday, February 11th, citing Egyptian sources, Israeli media reported that Egypt had sent about 40 tanks and armored personnel carriers to northeastern Sinai within the past 2 weeks as part of a series of measures to bolster security on its border with Gaza. And let's recall, it wasn't widely reported at the time, but on November 1st of last year, 3 weeks after the assault on Gaza began, the Egyptian Prime Minister stated, and I quote, "We are ready to sacrifice millions of lives to protect our territory from any encroachment," close quote. In addition, within the past several days, the Egyptian government has threatened to suspend the peace treaty with Israel if it launches a full-blown military operation on Rafah in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. On that same day, Sunday, February 12th, the Saudi Foreign Ministry warned that there would be, quote, "very serious repercussions," close quote, for Israel if it invaded Rafah. And also within the last 48 hours, the monarch, the King of Jordan, has visited Washington, spoken with the Prime Minister of Canada as well, and by all indications, the message that he had to deliver to Biden and to Trudeau was a dire one. And I think it's fair to say, given the prior statements by the Jordanian government in the past 4 months and the general attitude towards what have been traditionally U.S. allies in the Middle East to this genocidal assault on Gaza, that the Jordanian monarch had a tough message to deliver, as much as one could perhaps expect from so close an ally to the United States, to the President of the United States and to the Prime Minister of Canada. Now, of course, again, we have lots of reason to be skeptical, given the conduct of these governments, the governments of Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia over the past years, if not decades, that their concern for the Palestinian people is questionable, to put it mildly. In fact, one could construct a fairly persuasive argument that they don't really care about the fate of the Palestinian people at all. But I think it's fair to say that they very much care about their own power, their own privilege, their own wealth, and their own security. And it's very clear that the temperature on the streets of Arab capitals is scorching hot. The peoples of the Middle East are outraged, and rightly so, with the genocidal assaults on Gaza and the failure of the global community to respect international law in occupied Palestine and Israel itself. And some indication of this, a powerful indication of this, which is a poll that was recently done in Saudi Arabia by an American polling firm, which found that well over 90% of the Saudis want their government to completely sever diplomatic relations with Israel, and also in excess of 90% want a Palestinian state to be established on the whole of historic Palestine, and not merely the very limited parts of Palestine, namely the 1967 borders that have been set aside for a Palestinian state by the United Nations for a number of decades. And so, confronted by this rousing, this boiling hot anger in the streets, one could easily imagine that the monarchs of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and the autocrat of Egypt are quite concerned about their own survival at this stage, political if not physical survival. And it bears remembering that several decades ago, a leader of Egypt, who was thought to be well entrenched in the power structures of the country, was assassinated by those who felt he had betrayed the Palestinian people by entering into a peace deal with Israel. So these people are not omnipotent, the autocrats of these three countries, and I think it's fair to say that at some point, due purely to the rising anger amongst their populations, they may well be required to act, if not militarily, then at least diplomatically and economically against Israel's genocidal regime. Now, on top of all of these things that have been happening from a public relations and diplomatic perspective, we have this zinger. On Monday, February 12th, U.S. and Israeli media reported that Joe Biden had repeatedly called Benjamin Netanyahu an a-hole due to his growing frustrations with Netanyahu's refusal to quote-unquote scale back Israel's assaults on Gaza, whatever that may mean. Obviously, given the importance of U.S. military and economic support to the state of Israel, particularly at this very delicate time for the government of Israel, this must be of some concern, or would seem to be of some concern to the Israeli political elite. Now, I think, again, it behooves us to have a realistic assessment of what all of this means. First, let me say that calling Benjamin Netanyahu an a-hole is at this point probably just about the nicest thing you could say about the man. A much more accurate description of Benjamin Netanyahu would be monster. Putting that aside, despite all of the claims that have been made by anonymous sources from within the Biden administration to the Western press over the last several months, and there have been many of them, that Joe Biden is frustrated with Benjamin Netanyahu, and Joe Biden is pressuring Benjamin Netanyahu, and Joe Biden is trying to persuade Benjamin Netanyahu to be less violent in Gaza, to be more respectful of the lives of Palestinian civilians. There has not been any indication whatsoever that the Biden administration has relaxed, restricted, reined in its support, economic, military, political, rhetorical, support in every conceivable sense for Israel's government and military while it is conducting what is clearly a genocidal assault on Gaza. And so we have great reason to be skeptical about the intentions of the Biden administration, notwithstanding the president's reported resort to scatological terms to describe the Israeli prime minister. And I could easily imagine, of course, I don't know whether this happened, but in the current circumstances, I could easily imagine that very early on in this genocidal war on Gaza, there was a conversation between a senior Biden administration official, let's say Antony Blinken, and the Israeli prime minister or some other senior official from the Israeli government, a private conversation in which went something along these lines. Look, President Biden is in an election year. There's a tremendous amount of anger, not only amongst the Arab and Muslim communities in the United States who have traditionally supported Biden, but amongst the youth of the country and many other segments of the support base of the Democratic Party, with the way in which Biden has given unqualified support to Israel. There is also rising anger in the streets in countries that have traditionally been allied with the United States government in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And so from a public perspective, from a rhetorical perspective, it's going to be very important in the months ahead for the President of the United States to distance himself somewhat from some of the more controversial actions of the Israeli military in Gaza. But at the same time, he'll continue to provide rhetorical support, even though he'll have to engage in some distancing. And certainly when it comes to providing the all-essential weaponry to the Israeli military, you can count on that flow of weapons to continue. You can count on the Biden administration to provide all of the economic aid that the Israeli government needs. You can count on the Biden administration to block any meaningful action by international institutions, particularly the UN Security Council, against Israel. But we're going to have to engage in this sort of posturing. And I could easily imagine that, having heard these comments from a senior Biden administration official, that Netanyahu would have said, I understand completely, these are the political realities, and I, on my side, will pretend that this is what you're telling us in private, and that the president is upset with us for being as aggressive as we're being, but that, we have to put the interests of the people of Israel first, and we got to do what we got to do. Did that conversation take place? I don't know, but certainly we have ample reason to believe that what we've been watching in the last several months really amounts to nothing more than a kabuki theater, with all of these supposed leaks by unnamed officials in the Biden administration to the press about how angry Biden is with Netanyahu. That being said, this kind of language being used, or reportedly being used, by the President of the United States in respect of Benjamin Netanyahu is certainly an indication of the level of pressure to which the Biden administration is currently subjected in terms of its ongoing support for Israel. So you look across the spectrum of interests and activities in this part of the world. You look at the economic spectrum, you look at the military spectrum, you look at the public relations spectrum, the legal spectrum. It has, by any rational measure, been a very bad week for the state of Israel. And the last thing I want to talk about is where all of this is heading. I wrote 2 articles early in the genocidal war on Gaza. It's actually one article in 2 parts, entitled America's Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier is Sinking. And for those of you who haven't read the articles, which are available on my website, DimitriLascaris.org, that phrase comes from the former U.S. Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, describing Israel as America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. And what I postulated at that time, in October and November of last year, was that Israel was heading to a strategic defeat. I think that is now really beyond reasonable doubt for those of us who are looking at the facts on the ground in a realistic manner and watching the world's attitude towards Israel change dramatically, and Israel becoming an international pariah, its economy going into a tailspin, its military not having achieved within 4 months of savage warfare any of its stated objectives, including the liberation of all the hostages and the destruction of Hamas. It's very clear that that's precisely where Israel is heading, towards a strategic defeat. And the only question, I think, for those of us who are looking at this realistically, is how and when is that defeat going to happen? And my greatest fear is that the defeat will have to happen because of the abject refusal of the United States government and its allies in the West to hold Israel to account and put a stop to this slaughter, which they easily could do by cutting off economic and military aid in relations with Israel. My greatest fear is that that strategic defeat is going to be inflicted upon Israel militarily, ultimately, and not in the distant future, but in the reasonably near future. Not only should that be of great concern to us because it will inevitably result in far more death and destruction than we have already seen in the region, but in particular, it must be remembered, and this is something that isn't talked about nearly enough in the West, that Israel has a very considerable nuclear arsenal. And I, for one, I hope I'm wrong about this, but I don't really doubt the willingness of the Israeli military and its political leadership to use nuclear weapons if it thought that it was necessary to do that in order to avoid a military defeat. And of course, if that were to happen, we'd all be in serious, serious trouble. It also ought to be recalled that Russia announced recently that it was entering into a strategic partnership with Iran. The Chinese government has very close relations with Iran, relies critically upon oil and gas from Iran to sustain its economy. The Chinese government has become increasingly critical of the state of Israel and the United States for the conduct of this war and their policies with respect to the Palestinian people. China's economy would be injured quite severely if oil were to be cut off or even interrupted on a temporary basis from the Middle East to China. And on a long-term basis, both Russia and China would be damaged significantly in the region if the Iranian government were to fall and were to be replaced by a pro-Western, anti-democratic government such as Iran had from the time that the CIA and the British overthrew Iranian President Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s up until the Iranian Revolution. That was, of course, the Shah of Iran, who brutally oppressed dissent within Iran and effectively did the bidding of the United States government for quite some time, leading ultimately to the revolution in Iran. And the Iranian people haven't forgotten that, and whatever you may think of the Iranian government, there's plenty to criticize in its record. Nonetheless, I don't think there are too many people in Iran who want to return to the era of the Shah, and you can be sure that seeing that kind of a leader installed in power in Iran is not something that the Russian government or the Chinese government would want. And we've gotten some indication of this within the past few days when it was announced that before March 20th, the navies of the Russian Federation, China, and Iran are going to conduct military exercises together. I don't think we should have any doubts about the message that is intended there. The Russians and the Chinese are signaling that somehow, some way, they are going to come to Iran's aid, if not militarily, then in other respects, if not by means of direct military intervention, then in other respects, should Iran come under attack by the United States. And frankly, we continue on the current trajectory. I think that an all-out war potentially involving the state of Iran and all of the catastrophic consequences of that war will become simply unavoidable. So let us hope that the leaders of the West come to their senses, that they employ their political means, their legal means, their economic means to put an end to the slaughter in Gaza, to oblige the Israelis to finally comply with the will of the international community and give the Palestinian people freedom and justice, and if not a Palestinian state, then equal rights within one state, because the alternative, frankly, is too terrible to imagine. This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from Kalamata on February 14th, 2024.